Good stuff as ever. Well, I'm joined now by former Conservative Minister Anne Widdecombe. Anne, thanks for coming on the show. It's always a pleasure. It might be a good place to start before we start looking ahead to some detail potentially later on from James Cleverly. This notion that Keir Starmer is channeling his inner Maggie Thatcher. I mean, you served under Mrs Thatcher. What on earth do you think's going on with Keir Starmer when he says things like this?
Well, Starmer has no inner Thatcher, I can tell you that right now. Thatcher was made of absolute steel. She was called the Iron Lady, and for a good reason, which was that she had an agenda and she pursued it. And she pursued it through all difficulties and against all opposition, some of it from within her own party. Now, Starmer is the exact opposite. Starmer will announce a policy and 5 minutes later he'll go into complete reverse. And if you look at some of the things he said about Thatcher in the past, they haven't suggested, and certainly don't suggest to me, that he is particularly keen to follow her example. So what's this about? It's about trying to appeal to Tories, but it's so nakedly transparent that no Tory is going to be appealed to by that.
OK, Anne, and looking ahead to shortly, we're going to be crossing to the Commons. James Cleverly expected to put some flesh on the bones about controlling immigration, salary caps, bringing down numbers, dependent caps. The big question, Anne, is have we heard all of this before? Is this yet more rhetoric at the 11th hour? Do you think it's too little too late to save the Conservatives?
We've heard it all before. And if this is what they wanted to do, they've had at least 4 years in which to do it. Some would argue that they've had 13, but they've certainly had, since Boris Johnson claimed to have delivered Brexit, they've had 4 years in which they could have done any of these things. This is pre-election panic. That is what it is. And I can see some of it collapsing in the first 5 minutes. I mean, graduate salaries are all very well. What about care workers, of which we have a massive shortage? And so what I will be expecting to hear, well, actually I won't be expecting it, I will be hoping to hear, but not necessarily expecting, is what are the measures that he's also going to take alongside the measures he's announcing to skill our own workforce so that we don't need to rely on foreign labour. I can see it all falling apart in very short order.
And Anne, we heard earlier about in France there was a terror attack at the Eiffel Tower on Saturday, but we learned that a terrorist from a previous attack has been deported. The ECHR weren't consulted by the French. No lawyers got in the way. They simply got rid of somebody they thought they saw as a threat to their nation. The big question is, if the French can do it, why on earth can't the British?
Well, we should have done the very first time that an ECHR judge said that we couldn't do the Rwanda deportations, for example. We should have just gone ahead because those judgments from ECHR are merely advisory. Of course, we've now got, as a result of all the dithering and delay, we've now got a judgment from our own courts, which is not advisory. I mean, that judgment we do have to follow. So it looks as if the government is trying to concoct a plan which would make Rwanda, its Rwanda plan, compatible with what the Supreme Court asks. I foresee, without any great difficulty, a whole load of legal challenges ahead. This will not be implemented before the next election.
As we've been talking about Maggie Thatcher, as Starmer is trying to concoct his inner Thatcher, as we're about to learn what the Tories plan to do, I'll ask you this simple question. What do you think Maggie Thatcher would have done about the small boats crisis? What would Maggie Thatcher have done about the huge number of legal visas coming in through the front door?
Well, with the legal visas, that's easily enough. She would have changed the terms, which is now what the government is planning to do. She would also, I think, have clamped down on the number of dependents. And I would hope, and I haven't heard this trailed at all, but I would hope that he's going to look at student visas and at the worthwhileness of the courses which students come over here to study. They should only be coming over here to study very, very serious subjects, medicine, engineering, serious subjects, so that they can then take the skills back to their own country, not Mickey Mouse stuff. But as far as the boats go, I think Mrs Thatcher would have said, right, well, the instant you put foot on our shores, you will be detained in secure accommodation, you will be assessed quickly, and you will be sent back if you don't meet the criteria, instead of which we lay on hotels. Some of them really rather fancy hotels.
Yeah. There's a feeling of rolling out the red carpet. Another thing that I think really is sticking in the craw of Conservative voters especially are the huge number of dependents and that we see coming over. 96,000 dependents for student visas. In what planet is it a good idea to allow 96,000 children, wives, husbands, whomever, to come to Britain on the tailgate of students studying here? Surely the answer is just to clamp down on those dependent visas altogether.
Well, I think one has to be reasonable about this. I mean, if a student is over here for some years, it is probably unreasonable to say, well, he can't have his wife with him. And very often, and I've seen this happen, the wife, or some cases it might be the husband and the wife be the student, the other partner actually takes a job and works, which means that we get the taxes and we get the national insurance payments. But when, of course, they bring over children, and particularly if they bring over a large number of children, then what happens is that instead of we getting the taxes and the insurance, we're shelling out the education, we're shelling out the health services, and it puts a very different complexion on it. So I think we've got to go fairly carefully with this one. Do it, but do it and make it horses for courses, not a blanket decision either way.
Do you think this issue is now enveloping the Conservatives so much, that of immigration, that in a way Keir Starmer is able to constantly dodge the bullet and not give any ideas or any details of his own? There's almost a sense that they can just let the Conservatives sink as they've hit the iceberg of immigration. Or do you think, as Lee Anderson said earlier on, come the general election, the Labour Party will need to give us some proper detail to see what the difference is between the two parties?
Well, certainly Labour's going to have to produce a manifesto. So it's going to have to give some clear evidence as to what direction it's taking. It will have to. If it's to campaign, it can't go campaigning on a we don't know what we're going to do ticket. What it can do is to do what Blair very, very cleverly did, which was refuse to give any economic promises other than that he would keep the tax and spend programmes intact for a couple of years, until, as he put it, he had had a chance to really examine the books. And I think Keir Starmer is likely to say come the election, well, we hope to do this, but we need to look at the books. Or we hope to do this, but we need to look at the legal position. There's always going to be a qualification there. And believe me, on the performance at the moment, if he comes out with a policy and that policy creates a backlash, he'll reverse it. The very next day, he'll reverse it.
And there was news out this morning that 52 and rising Conservative MPs don't even plan to stand at the next general election, the second highest number of those jumping ship since 1997, since the Blair wipeout. With that in mind, and also the fact immigration seems to be such a huge issue, do you think immigration will be the issue that sinks Sunak?
Oh, I think immigration is probably already sunken because there's nothing he can do in the time that's left, and he hasn't shown any real will to tackle it and to really get to grips with it. So, I mean, he's only just, the only thing he really has produced that's different is the Rwanda plan, and that, as we know, so far at any rate, has gone absolutely nowhere. So I think he's already sunk, and I'm not surprised that Conservatives are jumping ship. They can see the polls. They know what's going to happen. Why not make preparations to earn a living rather than stand and find that on the night suddenly you haven't got a seat?
And Anne, there's lots of rumbles from the jungle. Of course, Nigel is down under and Rishi is talking about we're a broad church, don't rule anything out. They seem to be keeping the cat flap open for a Farage return. Is that something you think is an option, and is it something that may woo the electorate? Is that the answer to the Tories' woes?
Well, I'm afraid I really don't think it's at all likely that Nigel Farage will be leading the Conservatives into the next election, but he'll certainly be extremely active in reform and in getting the message out on immigration, on low taxes, on law and order. And I think most Conservatives will say, oh dear, I do wish he was leading us.
OK, Anne Widdecombe, always a pleasure, never a chore having you on the show. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon on GB News. It's just always great to talk to Anne. Don't forget, she served under Thatcher for many years. She knows what would have been done these days, and I think a lot of people out there who vote Conservative, who watch shows like this, just think, why can't we have a bit of that kind of spirit coming back? And it's OK for Starmer to channel his inner Maggie, but really, what are his ideas? I think we're just waiting to see, aren't we?